I thought I'd start with a quick outline of what I'm intending to talk about, so you have an idea whether where this is going and whether it's worth your time, frankly speaking. So I'm going to give you a quick little intro, just a personal intro, so you can better understand where I come from when I talk about localization and what my experience is in that field. I'll keep that very brief. I'm not a big fan to talk about myself. Then I'll talk a bit about Laureate, the organization I work for, and how localization fits into a Laureate context. And then I'll talk a little about what our localization strategy set out to achieve when I joined the project. I'll address a couple of barriers to successful localization. Again, I'm speaking purely from my own context and from what I learned within the context of Laureate. I'd like to then address a couple of issues that I've become aware of as I went through my own learning curve with localization, which I sort of captured under 6 P's. Under the 6 P's, I'll get into that further on, and focus on each of the 6 P's I'm intending to address. Then I'll talk a little bit about a successful introduction of localization in an organization and about pitching localization up the chain. Laureate is probably the biggest name in education you might have never heard of. It's a leading for-profit education provider operating from the United States. We are headquartered in Baltimore. It's currently a private organization with about more than $3 billion revenue annually. Laureate and manages about over 75 institutions globally. When I say institutions, I'm talking about educational institutions, universities, and a couple of institutes. Its primary growth areas are in Latin America and Asia. Here's a map of all our campuses. It hardly fits on the map, and the area we're represented. We serve about 800,000 students all throughout all these campuses through on-campus and online learning. And as I mentioned earlier, we have about 75 institutions globally, and this represents, the breakdown. The slide I'm showing currently represents the breakdown of where we are mainly active. Latin America being a big growth region, and so is Asia, as I mentioned earlier. There are a number of big names associated with Laureate. Most famous one is President Bill Clinton, who is the honorary chancellor of the Laureate International Universities Network. But we also regularly see Tony Blair, who is associated with Laureate and often gives lectures at one of the Laureate universities. Condoleezza Rice has been doing rounds at the universities, as well as numerous Latin American and Asian distinguished individuals that are regularly affiliated with the organization. We have recently received an investment from the World Bank of about $150 million to support Laureate's efforts in the education area. And Laureate is also affiliated with Coursera. I'm not sure whether you've heard of Coursera, but Coursera is the leading provider of the so-called MOOCs, massive online open courses. Laureate has a stake in that also. So education is the game pretty much, and Laureate is extremely active in that field. Let me tell you in a few words what the mission of the organization is. It comes down to trying to expand access to higher education to make the world a better place. So it subscribes to a social mission, to making quality higher education accessible and affordable, and to providing a professionally oriented education with an international perspective. Now, I've highlighted the words that have to do with localization. Expanding access obviously speaks to more programs in more languages. Being accessible and affordable speaks to working with additional partner institutions at a lower cost, which tend to be in non-Western countries, Latin America and Asia primarily. And international perspective, which obviously talks about ensuring global relevance in a local context, which again is a familiar notion if you talk about localization. The following slide represents a number of our brands. This is just a snapshot. As I mentioned, we have over 75 institutions. This is a snapshot of various institutions all over the world. They tend to be premier private universities. You know, this is a complex structure that Laureate owns, and it drives the need to develop globalized products suitable for localization and branding by multiple Laureate institutions. Now, let me talk a bit about Laureate, about localization in our particular context. And I thought I'd start with a graph you've probably seen a lot. I've sort of repurposed it for Common Sense Advisory with no other reason to just give you an idea of where we were located as an organization when we entered the localization domain, which was about 2010, end of 2010. We were in the middle of an aggressive international expansion and acquisition phase, and we had a fast growth in, and as mentioned several times, our growth areas were Latin America and Asia. So if you're familiar with this particular model of the Common Sense Advisory, you know, we were, if I put it very positively, we were in phase one. We were in a very reactive mode, and some levels of the organization, some individuals in influential positions had a fairly negative, you know, idea about this whole push to expand internationally. There was a real challenge on the leadership level in the sense that we had a disconnect between what and how, between the what and the how of going international. On the one hand, there was this idea of moving quickly and aggressively to respond to perceived international opportunities, but there wasn't really a solid strategy in how to really get there. And the intricacies of localization were not at all understood, and they were at best an afterthought. There was a really good reason why this was happening. Laureate has exploded pretty much as an organization. It's only about 15 years old, and its origins are US-centric. Its operations are US-centric, so it had very little, you know, activity in other countries. In addition, you know, the organization had a very strong leadership. However, the leadership was fairly US-centric also. So we had very few people that had a lot of exposure to international, you know, operating internationally. We also had a fairly stratified organizational structure, and the international push had more often had more of a characteristic of a pet project rather than, you know, a solid corporate strategy. And the last point I think that was relevant, that made localization in our particular context very challenging, was that we had a fairly centralist paradigm in terms of how to operate. It was very focused around what headquarters deemed important. Nevertheless, there were a number of very clear opportunities knocking at Laureate's door, which was an eager and prestigious network that we had built up in Latin America with tremendous growth perspective. There was also a strong CEO backing for, you know, this idea to take our product internationally, and, you know, there was an intention to leverage our assets. So let me share with you what our starting point was. As I mentioned, we were a very US-centric organization, and our entire product development you know, capacity grew out of serving a single client. The flagship organization, the flagship university, that is sort of the face, the facade, or, you know, the primary university in the US that Laureate runs is Walden University. And, you know, our entire centralized course development capacity, since that's a university that serves over 50,000 students, we have a centralized development capacity that was pretty much developed to serve the needs of Walden. We also built up a huge repository of previously developed courses over the years, but, you know, the course development process was pretty much exclusively developed to serve Walden University. So we had a single client orientation. Now, with that strong expansion happening, obviously there was an intent to leverage our course development capacity and our ability to produce high standard courses and apply that to other institutions. So the idea then was, the question then became, how do we create content that has a much more global orientation rather than institution specific? And how can we, leverage the effort that we make to create a particular content and maybe serve multiple institutions with that? Multiple institutions meaning, international institutions. So, a particular product could be rolled out in English, in Spanish, and Turkish. Well, we're right in the middle of localization here. But it meant we needed to make some serious adjustments to our content development process. So the goal initially, when we launched into our international endeavors, was to leverage the content development structure, expertise, and existing content. We also wanted to enable a simultaneous launch of what we called signature products in key geographies. Signature products are, a number of outstanding courses that we've developed, primarily Masters in Business Administrations, which is a very popular educational product, obviously. We also wanted to maintain flexibility to make changes based on stakeholder preferences. So we had, multiple universities wanting a Masters in Public Administration or Masters in Business Administration, but they wanted it a particular way. They wanted to add their flavor to it. Another objective that we had was to, in our division, look in the eyes of our partners. We were trying to sell our centralized course development capacity to them in order to leverage this and to, minimize redundancy. And we also wanted to pull additional business in delivering high quality and faster and cheaper centrally than possible locally. So again, it was about leveraging our course development capacity. A particular challenge was to make our product available to low-cost markets and brands. Course development traditionally was fairly expensive, and it worked for Western-based universities, with Western level tuition fees. But it was really challenging to make it equally attractive for non-Western universities. And finally, we obviously intended to ensure high quality translation, fast turnarounds against low cost. So the initial idea in the company was to hire course developers, which are sort of it's our bread and butter. Within our unit, these are individuals that write the courses. We have about 200 of them in the organization. So traditionally, these were English-speaking individuals. So the initial idea was that we should hire course developers to write in the target language. The issue with that was, where do you find a course developer that can write intelligently about a range of topics, do so in a foreign language, and is willing to be located in one of our central offices? Oh, and of course, is willing to do the work at a reasonable salary. So it turned out to be very challenging to find caliber of person. The organization nevertheless set out to hire these people, and this is the point at which I came on board. And initially, I was tasked with overseeing the recruitment, heading up the team, and ensuring the quality of this pool of people that was being hired. Now, about 2 weeks into my role, I went back to the vice president who had tasked me to do this, and effectively had a conversation that boiled down to that this wasn't really a good idea to go about it this way. I didn't feel it was very sustainable. Neither did I think that we had a real shot at making it, at finding the individuals that we were seeking as well as making it cost effective. So we started talking about an outsourced model through translation and vendors. And what we arrived at, and nobody understood this at that time, but what we ultimately wanted to set up was what we later called the WIPO system: write once, publish often. It's been used in different industries also, but for us it had a different meaning. We can't simply take a course and translate it and make it work in a different context. There's always need for adaptation to context. Many of the materials are not necessarily available in different languages. So in our context, it actually means a lot of adaptation work. So what happened is that when we proposed this approach, basically at that point in time, we had a number of executives running ahead with the project, and it was a very highly political, very visible project, and they launched into the development of a couple of masters in business administration in Portuguese and Spanish, and effectively there was no time to pause and think it through. So it ended up being a quite tense situation between the stakeholders that wanted the product delivered and our own unit that was in charge of actually writing the content. I was effectively pulled off the project and asked to use that time in the interim to examine whether we had alternatives, because the vice president to whom I report had a sense that this was going to boomerang around and basically end up on our plate after all, after a while, since we are the product development team. So effectively, sooner or later we will be charged with developing the product, even though temporarily there was a sort of a team that took it on and ran with it. So we used this period where this team of executives forged ahead as an opportunity to really investigate what our alternatives were. And at that point, I was lucky to bump into people such as Andrew, that put me on the right trail. Localization World, many other organizations and events that probably many of you are familiar with. That became our world for about 6 months, where I talked to 2 dozen vendors. I spoke to lots of consultants, and effectively spent about 3-4 months examining what were our options if we wanted to do course development in a different way than was originally conceived. Which leads me to sort of the core of my presentation. There are a couple of things that I learned in the course of these 18 months where we were learning about localization and setting it up, and they can pretty much be summarized in what I've come to call the 6 P's. First one is politics. The second one is processes. The third one is people. The fourth one is problems. The fifth one relates to product. And the sixth one is relevant, yet I place it in a category of its own, is price. Education in general is a very political endeavor, and private education is even more political. There is a reason why we have big names associated with the organization, than why they visit foreign institutions regularly. One of the reasons is obviously to clear political paths to strengthen the position of private education in many countries where there traditionally wasn't much private education. And the second reason is obviously credibility and prestige. Now, this approach has been very, very rewarding for Laureate, but the downside is that sort of politics has also become part of our culture. This means that an aggressive foray into foreign markets wasn't only driven by a strict business rationale. There were many other agendas, which led to this endeavor being very top-heavy. My conclusion based on that is that if you want to introduce localization to a large organization, one of the things that you absolutely have to figure out is where it sits politically and whose political nerves it is going to touch and how. That's one of the key learnings I took away. The second learning was about process. In my case, it meant focusing on and proposing a process for localization to cut through the politics and diminish the need for day-to-day top-level involvement. So after about 6 months of research, attending Lock World, talking to dozens of vendors, consultants, it turned out that my vice president, his hunch was right. The team that was running our first signature project developments into Spanish and Portuguese wasn't seeing the results that after, and it ended up being very high cost endeavor, and they weren't seeing the translation quality that they had expected. They were growing very frustrated. They were growing very frustrated, and several vendors were fired, and eventually internally had started to roll also. So it became a very scrutinized, intense endeavor. And at that time, about 6-7 months into the process, there was readiness for some alternatives. At which point, my own VP stepped into the picture and suggested that we organize a meeting for all the stakeholders, proposing some alternatives based on the research that I had been charged to conduct for about 6 months. And we effectively proposed a much more structured and centrally managed approach, which we invited all stakeholders to the table, and we shared our research and heard several external experts. Rockant was present at that particular event. We made an organizational case, we made a business case, we made an efficiency case, and effectively we gave people a way out of the mess that had been sort of had evolved over time around our signature projects and our signature product and the localization effort. So as an interim conclusion to what process is about getting around the politics, emphasizing best practices, scenarios, and processes. You need to spend sufficient time to allow understanding of the complexity of something to sink in order to be able to get around the initial politics. Which leads me to the third point, which I realized was crucial when you're introducing localization organization, which is the people element. If you haven't read between the lines so far, it really all comes down to people. People in leadership positions, those connected, trusted enough to push business in a new direction. People in operational positions, those who have to adapt their day-to-day work to new requirements. In our case, as is often the case, localization was initially considered a tail-end endeavor. It's set at the end of a 9 to 12 month course development process, which involved creative folk, quality control people, media people, technical people who ran our platforms, all connected by a waterfall model. So when localization started, nobody really understood the intricacies and how the front end people were essentially made responsible for tail end outcomes, which put a lot of pressure on the system. They were not familiar with the requirements, linguistic requirements of localization. They could not fully control the outcome, but they were held accountable, which produced tremendous amount of stress. So needless to say, people felt extremely confused. They felt pulled in multiple directions. They had too much on their plate without clear criteria, and there was a lot of confusion and finger pointing that ensued from that. So again, another interim conclusion, localization affects people. People, especially on operational level, will support localization not based on a business case, but based on the impact they experience on a day-to-day basis. So when localization becomes extra work, particularly the kind of work that distracts from the core skills and tasks, it will be resented. So successfully introducing localization implies relieving people of these stresses and giving them clear pathways to success. Sometimes this means getting down and dirty and dealing with key individuals on a one-by-one basis, either pulling them in or sometimes making sure that they stop being a disruptive factor. Which leads me to the next P number 4, which are the problems. Localization, if successful localization, really implies the resolution of a number of problems. Whenever new goals, processes, requirements, etc., especially when they require new skills, understandings, when these are introduced into an organization, they are bound to be problems. In our case, an inherited siloed course development process led to a misaligned process and lack of communication, generating many errors and causing tail-end work. We could clearly identify the mistakes, but often had tremendous difficulty tracing down its origins. So it was very important for us to separate the problem from the people, then move towards finding structural solutions. So once again, an interim conclusion for me was that as an individual in charge of localization internally, you will be judged primarily on your capacity to resolve problems while managing the people dimension. This really extends to your relationships with a vendor and other external parties. When I selected our preferred vendor, for example, my single most important criteria for selecting them was their communication and relationship management skill. All of the vendors I approached had technical skills. That wasn't really the issue. But there were very, very significant and very clear variations in terms of their communication and relationship management skills. And frankly speaking, some of the bigger names turned out to be very weak at that particular aspect. Which leads me to the next P that is highly relevant for localization, which is obviously the product. My personal conclusion was that individual, let alone institutional, memory is very, very short. Once you break through the politics and and you establish a basic process, which took us about 6 months in our localization work, emphasis very quickly shifts to product. We had 3 core products that we were trying to come out with. Our course content, which is basically the courses that we offer online. Third-party resources, these are articles and all sorts of documentation that support our courses, and media, primarily subtitles, closed captioning. Now, what ended up happening is that cause and effect were, forgotten about 6 months into the localization process. While once we had set up, an alternative system, we still had legacy content problems, all sorts of linguistic mistakes, which actually originated within our own organization, and the lack of initial process and process alignment were attributed to the vendor, while the vendor had very little to do with it. When it comes to product, organizations tend to have a very myopic perspective, is my conclusion. And here's where the previous P's really come into play. When a product is judged, you better know your political weight and bandwidth, be able to understand and explain the process that led to the product, and have the support from key people who were involved, and then be able to accurately determine the cause of the product problem. There are not too many second chances in that sense. Which leads me to the final P, which is price. And I put this in a separate category and intentionally as last, because my experience is that it has been often overemphasized. Fact is that most vendors are very competitive on price, and there's not much variation. One also quickly learns as a new, sort of new party to localization, that top vendors tend to use the same top subcontractors, so not much variation there either. So once again, it really comes down to the first 5 P's. In our case, first, all emphasis in the beginning, all the emphasis was on quality. We spent way too much on ensuring quality, and then the emphasis quickly shifted to price. Let me give you an anecdote. When we started the process, the quality was of such a concern that we were continuously quizzed and queried and fact-checked and QA'd on quality. So we established a number of stopgap measures, checklists, and validation processes, etc., etc. At one point, we had pretty much 100% success rate in hitting our benchmarks, and the same the same clients that had asked us to ensure quality all of a sudden turned around and said, "Why is it so expensive? Why do you have all these processes in place?" That's what I was referring to with my earlier example, that there is lack of understanding often how cause and effect are related. So once we managed to prove we had quality, we could start working on the price question. So be aware that price matters a lot to an organization that are not familiar with localization. It's at the front end of the engagement. Then it begins to matter again once everything is running smoothly. In between, it seems, our organization at least got lost in a learning curve, the chaos, the adaptation, the politics. It's at this stage that many vendors seem to fall. In our case, we lost 3 to be exact. It seems that you will not win many clients by emphasizing price, but by focusing on the other 5 Ps. Once you are a trusted partner, price becomes part of a much more balanced mix of attributes. So my conclusion, based on this particular learning, is that you need to look at pricing from a broader perspective. You may be able to undercut your competitor's price, but can you really live up to the politics, people, and problems condition? So let me turn to a couple of tips that I summarized from all these, 2 years of engagement with localization. The first one is, and this was very, very important in our particular context, is to build a solid vendor relationship. I couldn't have been successful in any way, shape, or form without having a very transparent and committed vendor. I went out of my way to make sure that they understood the conditions that they were getting into, and we worked for several months to make sure that we could have a transparent relationship where they could red flag any issues that they saw coming up on our end, and I could red flag things on their end to make sure that we could build a partnership that would be able that was able to weather the circumstances, the very rocky circumstances of the beginning of our localization experience. Another key factor was building internal executive level support. There were a number of key individuals. I referred to my vice president earlier on, but also my immediate line of support, which were indispensable in making this work. I spent a lot of time basically reporting to them, educating them, if you wish, about localization and everything I learned, for them to create the proper conditions for localization to be able to take root in our organization. Another aspect which proved crucial was the need to eliminate speculation and subjectivity. Language being of such a subjective nature, one of the first things that we established were a number of benchmarks and quality scorecards and processes as to who was going to determine what in order to get away from speculation and subjectivity. Our challenge was that we were dealing with native speakers on the receiving end that had very particular ideas about how they would say something. So it wasn't a matter of it being incorrect in Spanish or Portuguese. It just wasn't their flavor. And since we didn't have the in-house capacity to understand that or push back, it was perceived as a quality problem, while in essence it wasn't. So we needed to cut through that and establish, basically empower our vendor in particular to make the final call. I already mentioned the whole issue of resolving problems. This was tremendously important. We gained a lot of support by simply being able to take other people's problems and resolve them through proper process. This sounds a little contradictory, but it really isn't. I'm not overemphasizing money here. I'm just saying that it is important to show the organization what the financial impacts and benefits are from establishing a structured localization process. In our case, we were able to show 30-40% savings once the process was in place, and drastic quality improvements, which then speaks for itself and really cuts through the politics. Another important aspect of making this work is to transfer the individual learning, which often happens. Individuals like myself are tasked to take this on very often. We're very green. We don't really know. We learn a lot over a period of time, but it comes down to transferring that learning into the organization in some shape or form to make it sustainable. And finally, this is my personal approach to things, but I still think it might be a good tip. It's often about letting others take the credit. When people work in a very complex environment and they face all sorts of problems that they are rightly or not rightly held accountable for, the antidote to that is making sure that there is moments when people can take credit for things, even if they weren't a huge factor in that. It really helps solidify relationships and gain support for a process. The final thing that I just wanted to share with you before going into some questions is, back to the core theme of the topic: how do you pitch this up the chain? In our case, this was really, the localization started as a project, and we were aware of the fact that we were tucked away in some corner with very little visibility beyond our immediate environment or beyond the immediate executives that were dealing with localization. And we also knew that the organization being as large and as international as it is, that there are many other areas where localization is relevant. So we worked out a process by which we could take this up the chain and make it a corporate strategy rather than a project, starting with our own learning curve and considering our own localization a pilot, rolling out that strategy and system throughout our own division, and then moving towards Laureate-wide implementation through garnering the buy-in of higher level executives, continuously evaluating, adjusting, developing, and implementing the process, and continuously refining it, because there was a clear understanding from the beginning that there was no silver bullet, there was no one mold fits all type of solution for this. So the way we approached this was we learned about other areas in the company that might require localization. We analyzed additional leverage and cost-saving areas, tried to secure executive support, and sought opportunities to share and resolve other people's problems beyond our own immediate organization. So if I would have to summarize this whole story into a single thought, I would say that localization, from my perspective, is not so much a business challenge as it is an organizational culture challenge. I've learned that making localization work requires a very particular type of organizational culture. Sometimes it exists and it fits in naturally. In our case, it simply did not exist, and we needed to create an environment which would at least, diminish the conflict. What is interesting, and I don't know to what extent this is related to, sort of our own learning curve, is that as a result of this, learning and localization, many new areas of improvement emerged. We realized that, we weren't that tail end after all, that many things that were happening upstream were so interconnected with what was happening downstream in localization, and it revealed many structural and cultural issues within the organizations that are now currently being addressed. I like to think that we had at least a small share in that. So with that, I had been on half an hour monologue. So let me just stop right here and hopefully get field some of your questions or, some thoughts and discussions. I'd be really interested to hear whether any of this resonates at all. Thank you so much.
Uh, Thank you, Alan, for a wonderful presentation. It's always a special honor if our clients actually go out and share some of the projects that we have been involved in, and we otherwise cannot share because I think as we've seen, there are some sensitivities always with these kind of initiatives around people and politics. And
Mm-hmm.
by the way, if you have some questions, you can put them into the question box in your GoToWebinar question box, and then I will read them to Alan, and Alan will answer some of those. I think one
Can you
question.
still hear me? You can still hear me, or am
Yes,
I
I
on
can.
mute right now?
No, I can
Okay,
still
okay,
hear you.
great.
I can
Sorry.
still hear you. So,
I just wanted to, since you brought it up, I did want to compliment you personally because, I didn't refer to it much, but you were a key stakeholder in this whole process. So yes, it is very important to have external support. I just wanted to validate that.
thank you. I'm very very honored and flattered by your support here. Um, so one question that I have here is like, how could the vendor, your localization vendor, have helped you better managing politics and cultural change?
Mm,
And how
that,
would that and how should that be reflected in pricing?
yeah,
Yes.
that's a very good question. And frankly speaking, I don't think there's a system or methodology to that. I think it comes down to empathy and understanding. Trying to envision what the situation is that, a person like myself, and, I'm by no means unique or special in that sense, the type of environments that people are facing when they're introducing something that tends to be considered, just something you throw over the fence. I mean, people tend to think about, this, most of you are professionals, so you've in this area, so you've experienced this a million times, but it's a fact. People do not understand this process. They really don't know what it entails, and they just think, you have a text, give it to a translator and get it back. They have no idea what kind of impact it has on internal processes. They do not know how, mistakes or oversights on the on our organization side in this case are represented in cost. And very often the people that are tasked to manage this don't know initially either. So you find yourself in a situation where you're under attack from two sides. You're having to deal with a volatile situation internally, in the middle of a learning curve, and a vendor that depending on how the vendor positions themselves, they can position themselves as, sort of a know-all type of entity that shares information with you on need-to-know basis only, or they can position themselves much more as a type of coach that really displays patience and understanding with that internal process, and that makes a world of difference. It really is about feeling that you have a partner to work with. It's obvious that this is a business relationship. Nobody ever doubts that it's not that there is not money or business at stake. However, the positioning and the way that a vendor position themselves, call it emotional intelligence if you wish, the relationship manager that a vendor puts on a client like ourselves, can make all the difference. And I can tell you as an anecdote, without going into who and what, the vendor that we ultimately chose, actually we started off with a conflict. That because the way they took that feedback was so positive that it became the sort of the starting point of a relationship building, which proved crucial. So it's a long answer to a very short question, but I cannot give you a system. I would just encourage you to really try to understand your client. On the other hand, I will also admit that it takes, on the client side, hopefully the organization is also smart enough to put people in charge that, or to give people that space. That's not always the case. I will acknowledge that sometimes vendors are treated as disposable, which I don't think is very intelligent either, but it does happen.
So, by the way, you have here on the screen various ways to get in touch with us. If you have any questions after the webinar, just tweet at us or connect at LinkedIn, or go to our website and send us an email, and we'll be happy to forward that to Alain. I have one more question here, I guess, which is a follow up to your previous answer, which is, what is the biggest challenge to change the corporate culture? Was it understanding of what localization was, opportunity cost, the effort involved, etc.?
I think it's a combination of those things. In our particular context, I think the biggest challenge was expectations that were set at a very high level at the beginning of the process, which were simply unrealistic. Like I said, without going into details, and I'm not intending to throw anybody under the bus here, but the point is, it was a highly political process. We had a lot of high-level individuals involved that had set, very aggressive targets, and the operations folks involved simply were expected to comply with that. And when you're not exactly aware of what you're getting yourself into, it's hard to push back. There was some initial pushback because even in terms of what we were doing up until that point, it was very aggressive, but nobody really understood, what the implications were. So until it became clear that effectively the targets were unrealistic, we went through a lot of internal pain, so to speak. Internal divisions and individuals were scrutinized and effectively questioned. 3 vendors were replaced before, we started to understand better, where certain problems originated and where solutions could be found. So it was definitely not a smooth process.
Okay, great. So unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour, and so if you have any additional questions, please contact Rokan in either of the ways that they're on screen here, and we will forward these to Alain and get you an answer as soon as possible. Thank you very much, Alain. Thank you very much for everybody attending this webinar, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much for your attention, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Bye.
Bye-bye.